At 7:52 p.m., federal marshals reportedly began freezing assets tied to Donald Trump's inner circle. 4 properties, 7 financial accounts, multiple pending transfers flagged. And according to legal sources following the case, the entire operation was triggered less than 6 hours after Melania Trump finished giving closed-door testimony under subpoena. That is not normal. Federal judges do not sign emergency preservation orders this fast unless prosecutors convince the court that money could disappear immediately. And here's the part sending shockwaves through Washington tonight. 3 emergency defense motions were filed overnight, and all 3 were denied before sunrise. Think about that. A billionaire political machine backed by elite attorneys, congressional allies, and nonstop media support couldn't slow the legal system down for even a single night. Now, legal analysts are asking a terrifying question for Trump's team. What exactly did Melania confirm behind those sealed courtroom doors? Because prosecutors appeared ready before she even testified. The motions were already drafted. The seizure paperwork was already prepared. Her testimony may not have started the investigation, it may have completed it. And tonight, a 8-hour countdown is already underway. An appeals court decision, potential congressional subpoenas, and sealed testimony that insiders say could reshape this entire case before the weekend is over. This is no longer political theater. This is escalation. What changed everything was not the public headlines. It was what happened inside that sealed courtroom Thursday afternoon. According to sources tracking the proceedings, Melania Trump testified for nearly 4 straight hours under subpoena, far longer than most legal observers expected. And by the time she walked out, prosecutors were already moving at breakneck speed. That timing matters. At 2:14 p.m., prosecutors reportedly filed an emergency motion for asset preservation. By 4:33 p.m., a federal judge had already signed the order. No lengthy delay, no drawn-out public hearing, no waiting until next week. Just hours later, federal marshals were executing coordinated seizures tied to properties and financial accounts connected to Trump's orbit. Legal experts say that kind of acceleration almost never happens unless the court believes there is an immediate threat of assets disappearing. And here's where the story becomes even more explosive. The preservation order allegedly included specific account numbers, pending transfers, and multiple property addresses. That level of detail does not come from a witness improvising on the stand for 4 hours. Investigators appear to have already gathered the financial trail long before Melania entered the courtroom, which raises the real question tonight: was her testimony the beginning of the collapse or simply the final confirmation prosecutors needed to pull the trigger? Because once the court heard whatever was said behind those sealed doors, the entire posture of the case changed. This stopped looking like an investigation and started looking like enforcement. Even more shocking, Trump's legal team appeared completely blindsided by the speed of the response. 3 separate emergency motions were reportedly filed overnight, attacking the subpoena process, the scope of the seizures, and the timing of the court's order. All 3 were denied within hours. That is devastating for the defense. When judges reject emergency motions that quickly, it usually signals one thing: the court believes the evidence is already strong enough to justify immediate action. And according to several former federal prosecutors now weighing in publicly, same-day preservation orders tied to testimony are extraordinarily rare. They are typically reserved for situations involving flight risk, hidden assets, or fears that money could move before investigators can secure it. In other words, prosecutors may have convinced the court that waiting even one more weekend was too dangerous. And if that's true, then Melania Trump's testimony may have done far more than embarrass Trump politically. It may have accelerated the most aggressive legal escalation his inner circle has faced yet. By Thursday night, this stopped looking like a courtroom battle and started looking like a financial lockdown operation. The timeline alone is staggering. At 11:47 a.m., Melania Trump's closed-door testimony reportedly ended. Just 2 hours and 27 minutes later, prosecutors filed an emergency preservation request. By 4:33 p.m., a federal judge had signed off. And before most Americans had even finished dinner, federal marshals were already moving across multiple locations tied to Trump's network. That speed is almost unheard of. According to reports surrounding the order, at least 4 major properties and 7 separate financial accounts were targeted. 2 international transfers were allegedly flagged as pending. The legal phrase used in the filing, imminent risk of dissipation, may be the most dangerous detail of all, because in federal court, that phrase carries enormous weight. It means prosecutors convinced the judge there was a credible risk, assets could vanish, money could move offshore, or financial evidence could disappear if enforcement waited even another 24 hours. And suddenly, Trump's legal team found itself trapped. If they aggressively fight the freeze, prosecutors gain broader access to financial discovery, internal transfers, and account records. But if they accept the freeze, those assets remain locked while investigators continue building the case around them. Either way, the pressure escalates. Now add this to the picture. Multiple legal analysts believe prosecutors had these seizure documents prepared before Melania ever testified. The account numbers were reportedly specific. The property records were already organized. The motions were ready to go. That suggests something critical. Melania's testimony may not have introduced new evidence. It may have verified evidence investigators already possessed. And if that's true, then Thursday night was not a reaction. It was the activation of a plan prosecutors had been quietly building for weeks, maybe months. Meanwhile, panic inside Trump's orbit appeared immediate. Emergency filings were rushed into court overnight. Public statements accused prosecutors of political weaponization. Appeals were drafted before sunrise. But none of it slowed the timeline down. Not for 1 hour. By midnight, the preservation orders were still active. The seizures were still in place. And Washington was already waking up to a reality few people expected to see this quickly. A former president's financial world being locked down in real time. And according to several former federal prosecutors now speaking publicly, courts do not move this aggressively unless they believe the underlying evidence is extremely strong. Which means Thursday night may have been the moment this case crossed a line it cannot easily come back from. By early Friday morning, the message coming from Trump's legal team was unmistakable. This situation was spinning out of control fast. At 4:07 a.m., an emergency appeal was reportedly rushed to the 11th Circuit Court challenging the preservation orders as unconstitutional and overly broad. Just hours later, additional motions attacked the subpoena used to compel Melania Trump's testimony, arguing the entire process had been politically weaponized from the start. But here's the problem for the defense. None of those filings directly addressed the underlying evidence. Instead, nearly every argument focused on procedure, the speed of the order, the legality of the subpoena, the scope of the seizures. Legal experts immediately noticed the pattern. Because when attorneys stop aggressively disputing the substance of what prosecutors may have uncovered and start fighting the mechanics of how evidence was obtained, it often signals something dangerous. They may believe the factual record itself is becoming difficult to defend. And the timing made the panic even more visible. 3 emergency motions were reportedly denied before sunrise, not delayed, not partially granted, denied, one after another. That means multiple judges reviewed the defense arguments overnight and still refused to slow enforcement down. For a legal team with virtually unlimited resources, that is a devastating setback. Meanwhile, the public relations machine around Trump immediately shifted into overdrive. Allies began appearing on television accusing federal authorities of targeting a political figure. Statements described the seizures as government overreach. Congressional allies demanded investigations. Social media exploded with claims of election interference and judicial abuse. But behind the scenes, the legal danger kept growing. Because every hour the freeze orders remained active, gave prosecutors more time to secure financial records, review transfer histories, and potentially connect testimony to documentation already collected during the investigation. And according to several former federal prosecutors now commenting publicly, the defense may be facing its worst case scenario, a fast-moving federal enforcement process backed by a judge who appears convinced the risk of asset movement is real. One former appellate attorney put it bluntly, once courts approve emergency preservation at this speed, reversing it becomes extraordinarily difficult unless the defense can prove a major constitutional defect. That is a very high bar. Now Trump's team appears trapped in a 3-front war at the same time. They are fighting prosecutors in court, fighting political battles in Congress, and fighting a collapsing public narrative in the media, all while the legal clock keeps accelerating. And the most terrifying part for the defense may be this: the system still isn't slowing down. Because while Trump's allies were flooding television networks Friday morning, another major player was already preparing to enter the fight. Congress. Just when Trump's legal team appeared overwhelmed inside the courts, Washington exploded into the fight. By Friday morning, members of Congress were already demanding answers about the federal seizures. Emergency hearings were suddenly being discussed. Republican allies of Trump began accusing the Justice Department of turning federal law enforcement into a political weapon. And within hours, the story had transformed from a courtroom crisis into a full-scale political war. That escalation matters for one reason above all others. Congress operates outside the courtroom. Federal judges control legal rulings. Prosecutors control investigations. But congressional committees can launch parallel inquiries, subpoena officials, drag agency leaders into televised hearings, and completely reshape the public narrative surrounding a case even while the courts continue moving forward. And according to reports surrounding the situation, preparations for congressional involvement appeared to happen incredibly fast. Statements were already drafted. Television appearances were coordinated. Talking points flooded conservative media almost immediately after news of the seizures became public. That was not random. It looked organized. Suddenly, Trump allies were no longer just defending him legally. They were reframing the entire story politically. The message became clear. Don't talk about the evidence, talk about persecution. Don't focus on the asset freezes, focus on weaponized government. Don't ask what Melania may have confirmed, ask why federal authorities moved so aggressively against a former president's inner circle. And for a moment, that strategy may have worked, because the political temperature in Washington skyrocketed almost overnight. Cable news panels erupted, congressional figures demanded oversight hearings. Some Trump allies even suggested the Marshals Service itself should be investigated for the timing and scope of the operation. But behind all the noise, prosecutors still held the strongest advantage in the room. The courts were continuing to side with them. That's the part many political commentators seem to ignore. Every public statement attacking the investigation may have energized Trump supporters, but none of it changed the actual legal reality. The freeze orders remained active, the emergency motions remained denied, the appeals process kept moving. And according to legal analysts following the case, congressional outrage does not automatically weaken judicial enforcement. In some ways, it may have revealed something else entirely: fear. Because if Trump's allies truly believed the seizures were weak, politically motivated, or legally reckless, they would likely expect the courts to shut them down quickly. Instead, what terrified many observers was the opposite. Judges kept approving the escalation. And now prosecutors appeared to be operating on two battlefields at once. Inside the courts, they were pushing forward with aggressive enforcement. Inside Washington, they were suddenly facing a political counterattack designed to discredit the investigation before the public even saw the evidence. This is where the situation became dangerous for everyone involved. Because once Congress enters a legal firestorm like this, the conflict rarely de-escalates. Hearings create headlines, headlines create pressure, pressure creates leaks, accusations, and political theater. And all of it unfolds while the actual case continues moving underneath the chaos. By Friday afternoon, one thing was becoming painfully clear. This was no longer just a legal crisis surrounding Trump. It was becoming a national political collision between the courts, Congress, and the future of federal enforcement itself. And the next phase was about to become even more explosive. By the end of Friday, the situation around Trump no longer looked chaotic. It looked controlled. Not by the defense, not by Congress, but by the machinery of the federal court system itself. Because the deeper this case moved into emergency enforcement, the clearer the trap became. Every option available to Trump's legal team now carried enormous risk. Fight too aggressively, and prosecutors gain access to even more financial discovery. Stay silent, and the freezes remain in place while investigators continue building the case behind the scenes. It's a legal vice tightening from both directions at once. And according to several former federal prosecutors now speaking publicly, this is exactly how high-level financial pressure cases are designed to work. The moment emergency preservation orders are approved, the dynamic changes completely. The defense stops controlling the pace. The courts take over the timeline. And once that happens, every motion, every appeal, every public statement becomes reactive instead of strategic. That may already be happening here, because despite the outrage flooding television networks and social media, the core legal facts have not changed. 4 reported properties remain under preservation. 7 financial accounts remain frozen. Emergency motions were denied. Appeals are pending. And prosecutors are still moving forward quietly. That's the part many people miss. The loudest voices in Washington are now politicians and media personalities arguing over politics, bias, and weaponization. But inside the federal system, the process keeps advancing with cold precision. Documents are reviewed. Transfers are traced. Financial timelines are reconstructed. Testimony is compared against records already collected. And every hour this continues, the pressure on Trump's orbit increases because federal prosecutors understand something most political commentators don't. Financial cases are often won long before trial. Once assets are frozen and records are secured, investigators gain time, leverage, and control. That's why legal analysts keep returning to one terrifying phrase buried inside the preservation filings: imminent risk of dissipation. Those 4 words may explain everything. If prosecutors truly convinced the court there was a credible risk money could move or disappear, then judges are likely to remain extremely cautious about loosening restrictions, which means the defense could face weeks, potentially months, fighting uphill just to regain access to assets before the underlying allegations are even fully litigated. And historically, that is where many high-profile cases begin to collapse internally. Not during dramatic courtroom speeches, not during media interviews, behind closed doors, under financial pressure, as attorneys burn resources, as allies begin distancing themselves, as political support becomes harder to maintain, as people inside the circle start calculating risk for themselves. That's why some former DOJ officials are now comparing this moment to major federal asset forfeiture battles from the 1980s and early 2000s cases, where defendants initially appeared untouchable until financial enforcement started squeezing every available option. And now comes the most dangerous part for Trump's team: time. Because the clock is no longer their ally. Appeals deadlines are approaching. Congressional pressure is escalating. Prosecutors are reviewing seized material. And somewhere inside the sealed record of Melania Trump's testimony may be the detail that triggered this entire chain reaction in the first place. Which means the trap may already be closing faster than anyone outside that courtroom fully realizes. Now the entire case is entering its most dangerous phase yet: the 4 8-hour countdown. Because over the next 2 days, 3 separate decisions could completely reshape everything surrounding Trump, Melania, and the federal seizure operation that has already sent shockwaves through Washington. And according to legal analysts tracking the case, the first ruling may arrive faster than anyone expected. The 11th Circuit Court is now under enormous pressure to decide whether Trump's legal team deserves a temporary stay on the emergency preservation orders. That decision alone could determine whether the federal seizures remain fully active while prosecutors continue building their case, or whether parts of Trump's financial network temporarily regain breathing room. But here's why the situation is so explosive. If the court denies the stay, prosecutors immediately gain momentum. The preservation orders remain intact. The freezes continue. Investigators keep access to financial records and seized materials. And perhaps most importantly, the legal system sends a terrifying message to Trump's team. The courts are not backing away. Several former appellate attorneys now believe that outcome is the most likely scenario. Why? Because lower courts already denied multiple emergency motions in rapid succession. Historically, appellate courts are reluctant to reverse fast-moving preservation orders unless there is a clear constitutional defect or evidence of judicial abuse. And so far, judges appear unconvinced by the defense arguments. But if the 11th Circuit grants even a partial stay, everything changes politically overnight. Suddenly, Trump allies gain a powerful narrative that higher courts are questioning the seizures. Congressional hearings become more aggressive. Media coverage shifts. Supporters frame the ruling as proof the prosecution overreached. Even a temporary pause could buy the defense critical time to regroup before prosecutors tighten the pressure further. Which means the next 48 hours are not just about law. They are about momentum. And while the courts race toward a decision, Congress is preparing for its own escalation. Behind the scenes, lawmakers are reportedly debating whether to issue formal subpoenas connected to the Marshals Service operation and the prosecutors who pushed for emergency enforcement. That matters because congressional subpoenas would open a completely separate battlefield, one capable of dragging federal officials into televised hearings while the legal case is still unfolding in real time. Imagine the pressure this creates. Federal prosecutors attempting to defend emergency seizures in court while simultaneously facing political attacks from congressional allies of Trump. Every hearing becomes a media event. Every leak becomes a headline. Every procedural dispute becomes ammunition in a growing national war over whether justice is being enforced or weaponized. And yet, beneath all the political chaos, prosecutors may still hold the strongest card of all: the sealed testimony itself, because no matter how loud the public fight becomes, the actual contents of Melania Trump's testimony remain hidden from the public. Only the court has seen the full record. Only prosecutors know exactly what was confirmed behind those closed doors. And only the judge understands why the situation escalated with such extraordinary speed. That mystery is driving enormous fear inside Trump's orbit tonight. Because if the testimony merely repeated information investigators already possessed, prosecutors likely feel confident. But if Melania provided new financial details, timelines, or internal confirmations tying evidence together, then the danger to Trump's legal team could become far more serious than anyone outside the courtroom currently realizes. And then there's the wild card nobody fully understands yet: spousal privilege. Some legal commentators now believe the defense could attempt a separate motion arguing Melania's testimony should be limited, sealed further, or excluded entirely under marital protections. If that argument somehow succeeds, portions of the prosecution's enforcement timeline could face complications. But that is an enormous gamble. Because if the courts reject the privilege argument too, prosecutors emerge even stronger than before. Which brings us back to the countdown. 48 hours, one appellate ruling, possible congressional subpoenas, sealed testimony, frozen assets, and a federal enforcement process that still appears to be accelerating instead of slowing down. By the end of this weekend, the country may know whether Thursday night was simply another political controversy or the moment the walls truly started closing in around Trump's inner circle. But through all the headlines, the frozen assets, the emergency appeals, and the political warfare consuming Washington, one question still hangs over this entire case like a storm cloud. What exactly did Melania Trump say? Because despite days of nonstop speculation, the testimony itself remains sealed. The public hasn't seen it. Reporters haven't seen it. Even many political insiders appear to be operating on fragments, leaks, and educated guesses. Yet somehow, within hours of that testimony ending, the entire legal posture of this case changed dramatically. That is not a coincidence. And now legal analysts are increasingly divided into two camps. The first believes Melania simply confirmed information prosecutors already had: financial timelines, internal discussions, possible asset movements, details investigators had spent months assembling piece by piece. Under this theory, her testimony acted like the final key turning in a lock prosecutors were already prepared to open. But the second theory is far more explosive. Some now believe Melania may have provided entirely new insight that prosecutors did not fully possess before she entered that courtroom. Not necessarily a confession, not necessarily direct accusations, but enough clarity, enough verification, enough internal context to convince the judge that waiting any longer created unacceptable legal risk. And if that's true, then Thursday afternoon may become one of the most consequential closed-door testimonies in modern political legal history. What makes this even more complicated is the issue of spousal privilege. Trump's legal team may still attempt to argue that portions of Melania's testimony should never have been used to justify emergency enforcement actions in the first place. If courts entertain that argument seriously, the defense could try to weaken the very foundation prosecutors use to accelerate the seizures. But there's a major problem with that strategy. Judges have already seen the testimony. The preservation orders have already been signed. The appeals process is already moving. And federal courts rarely move backward once emergency enforcement crosses this threshold unless there is overwhelming evidence of constitutional violation, which means the real danger for Trump's orbit may no longer be the testimony itself. It may be what the testimony unlocked. Because tonight, somewhere inside sealed federal records, prosecutors and judges are looking at information the public still cannot see. Information powerful enough to trigger same-day seizures, emergency appeals, congressional outrage, and a legal countdown now dominating Washington. And until those sealed details eventually surface, if they ever do, the Melania question will continue haunting every part of this case. Not because people know what she said, but because of what happened immediately after she said it. Tonight, we are left with a picture almost nobody expected to see this quickly. A sealed courtroom testimony. Emergency preservation orders signed within hours. 4 reported properties frozen. 7 financial accounts locked down. Multiple emergency appeals already underway. Congress entering the fight. And a former president's inner circle suddenly facing one of the fastest moving federal enforcement escalations in recent memory. But through all the noise, one reality stands above everything else. The system kept moving. Not the media cycle, not political outrage, not social media narratives, the courts. And that may be the most shocking development of all. For years, critics argued that wealth, influence, and political power created a protective wall around America's most powerful figures. But over the last 48 hours, that assumption has been tested in real time under sealed testimony, emergency rulings, and a legal clock that still appears to be accelerating tonight. Now the entire country is waiting for the next decision. Will the appeals court slow this down? Will Congress escalate the political war even further? And most importantly, what did Melania Trump say that triggered all of this so fast? We may get answers sooner than anyone expected. Subscribe, because the next ruling could change everything overnight, and when it drops, we'll break it down here immediately.